exactly. The title slightly changed. It's not the legitimate use of force. Rather, I'm going to be talking about, justifying an intervention in general, not just an intervention that entails the use of force. So, what I'm going to try to do during this lecture, I'm basically going to look at some questions that sort of structure my lecture around three main questions. And throughout these questions, I'll try to look at Margaret Moore's political theory of territory and see what are the implications of her theory towards justifying an intervention. So we take her theory of territory as it is, see what conclusions she makes, and then try to sort of see what misses here, what issues remain unanswered, and possibly try to sort of at the end, come up with some sort of questions that we can, again, together address during the discussion. So I'm not trying to defend a specific hypothesis, rather I'll try to sort of analyze her theory or the implications of her theory onto justifying an intervention, and then see what remains unanswered or issues that remain unsolved. Yesterday, Zoran talked in much more depth about Margaret Moore's theory and provided a very sophisticated, deep critique. I'm not going to be able to do this, but I'll try my best to offer some good conclusions. So to talk about intervention, first of all, before I sort of dwell into this question of defining intervention, I'd like to quickly revisit the principle of non-intervention, the principle that governs the world system, and that is the corollary to the state sovereignty, the word we heard a lot about yesterday in these morning lectures too. So this principle has its legal and its moral sort of dimension or definitions. The legal definition, according to the International Court of Justice in the Nicaragua versus United States of America case, goes something like this. An intervention is only prohibited if it is bearing on matters in which each state is permitted by the principle of state sovereignty to decide freely. One of the issues is the choice of a political, economic, social, and cultural system and the formulation of foreign policy. So based on this, intervention is wrongful when it uses methods of coercion in regards to such choices, which should remain free. So it includes both direct and indirect use of coercion, meaning coercive behavior or action. Now, moral dimension of this principle is based on the moral value of the principle of self-determination that we talked about yesterday. Basically, self-determination includes not only the specific nature of institutional arrangements, but also a process through which the people come to establish these political institutions. So political subjects have the right to set the terms of their common way of life, and they cannot be freed by an outside party, meaning certainly not against their will. So self-determination is therefore the moral right of people to become free, sort of, by their own means, through their own process, and then non-intervention is the principle that guarantees that their path to freedom won't be influenced by, this interference of an outside party. So as Walzer would put it, he says the survival and independence of separate political communities in which men and women freely shape their separate destinies are the dominant values of international society. So intervention, according to Walzer, undermines these values by wresting control of the lives of the people in the target state. Now, my first question, as I said, I'm going to have three questions, is how we define intervention. So this is, I started thinking about intervention, okay, what does it mean to intervene? What is the sort of definition of this verb? Well, it says to come between as to prevent or alter a result or course of events. So an intervention is the act of inserting one thing between others. So like a person trying to help in a situation of usually conflict. Now, I came across McMahon's definition of intervention when I was sort of researching about this, and he states that his definition of intervention is of sort of a narrower scope. It goes like this. Intervention is the use of coercion, compulsion, or manipulation by some external agent or agents in an effort to affect or to prevent changes in the policies or practices of a state. Now, what he's basically trying to establish is that not every form of interference is an intervention, and that intervention by definition is sort of aggressive in a way, you know, that self-defense and other defenses are not forms of intervention, and that not every form of assistance is an intervention. Now, I'm not sure I agree with this definition, so I'll try to offer something different. You know, you think of a situation where we provide assistance to one party in a conflict, let's say financial assistance, okay? So it's not directly, you know, the use of force or sort of military assistance, but rather financial. Now, I think that though we are not actively coercing the other side to change its policies, I believe that we're still participants in the course of action of a party that we're helping, and that these actions that are directed at changing the political practice of the other party. So I understand that this is the sort of a minimal, you know, interference, but still I think that though we are only indirectly affecting the change of politics, I believe that we cannot say that, you know, we have no influence at all, as we are sort of acting upon a specific objective that corresponds to the objective of the party we're helping, which is aimed at altering the course of action of this other party in a conflict. So this form of intervention would be sort of a, you know, intervention in a broader sense. And on the one hand, we would have non-intervention, and, you know, in the context of war, we would have non-intervention. And then on the other hand, we would have a full-blown military intervention, and everything that comes in between that sort of needs to be defined on different matters. So what are these sort of criteria according to which we can define different types of intervention? I think it's defined by the means or methods that we use, and also by what objectives we support. So it's basically a matter of scale, you know, and definition of intervention that also includes assistance. Now, really briefly, you know, from the very beginning of the intervention, the definition of the principle of non-intervention, we've seen that why we should object to intervention. What are these reasons that intervention should be prohibited? Where McMahon really nicely puts these, you know, three sort of reasons why, three objections to intervention. First one rests on the idea of sort of respect for international or protection of international stability. It's like a prudence reason. Meaning giving priority to order over justice in international relations. Then the second reason would be that you know, intervention is inconsistent with respect for state sovereignty, which is then one of the essential foundations of the current world order. And finally, he says, well, the final concern would be that intervention is the violation of the right to self-determination of the citizens of the state that is the target of the intervention, because intervention involves an imposition of an external will on those subject to it. So it basically usurps people's right to shape and direct their own collective life. And with this objection, we see that intervention becomes not only a matter of, you know, conflict between order and justice, but it also becomes a conflict between competing demands of justice. Now, the second question would be, under what conditions could an intervention be justified? And here I turn to Margaret Moore's theory of territory, and try to see what she concludes based on her theory. So let me really briefly outline her conclusions, then I'm going to go back to see where in her theory she grounds these, where she draws these conclusions from, and then I'm going to provide some sort of a commentary on this. So her first, there's a chapter in her book that says, you know, it's called Territorial Integrity and the Use of Force. The conclusions of this chapter goes like, are four. So the first one is, she says, there is a third-party duty to assist people living in failed states to have an effective vehicle for their own self-determination. She says that this gives rise to a duty of intervention, but is extremely constrained, and it's both limited, you know, it's limited both temporally and in its goals. It should be only for the minimum amount of time needed to ensure a more effective governing agency, and with the aim only of ensuring that there is a vehicle, sort of an institutional structure by which the people can organize their own self-determination. Her second conclusion, she says intervention to halt, mass violation of human rights abuse, is justified, but it also ought to be exceptional with minimal duration, and the abuse of human rights has to be serious enough to satisfy the condition of proportionality, she says. Now, finally, she says, well, while failure to respect political self-determination rights is indeed the source of injustice, it is not of magnitude that would justify coercive intervention to secure them. So she rules out armed intervention on the basis of protection of the collective right to self-determination. Finally, she says, however, it may be a conditional just cause. So the cause that can be weighed in the calculations of benefits and burdens when intervention is also justified on other grounds. It's like as an additional good. If we have an intervention that's justified on the basis of protection of human rights, then we can also weigh into this calculation the promotion or the protection of the right to self-determination of the people. Now, what's her argument? I'm not going to go really deep into this because Zoran also talked about this, but I will have to sort of outline it. She has 3 premises and then a conclusion that she draws from these 3 premises. The first premise goes like this: State S holds territorial rights by acting as a vehicle of self-determination of Group G. Second premise, Group G is a group of the right kind to be the ultimate source of territorial rights. Premise 3, Group G legitimately occupies territory T, where territory is understood as a geographical space. Conclusion, therefore, State S legitimately holds territorial rights over territory T. So now, let's try to go through, each of these premises. Now, let's start from the very last one, that Group G legitimately occupies territory T. This is not, really relevant for my argument, but I'll just try to sort of really briefly say it. Well, she recognizes 3 types of place-related rights. She says there are rights of residency, rights of occupancy, and territorial rights. And now she defines them something like this. She says, well, rights of residency are held by individuals, meaning that individuals must be in the right relationship to the land that they're inhabiting, and then she, sort of has some conditions. Now she says, well, this is the condition for to say that the group rightfully occupies or possesses rights of occupancy to a specific land, and that then leads us to say that a state or territorial rights that are held by political institutions, that this group claims territorial rights based on these rights of occupancy and rights of residency over a particular geographical domain. So let me just quickly, I'm going to quote her here. She says, if I wasn't really clear, she says, rights to collective self-determination do not build straightforwardly on individual residency rights, but the individual members of the group must be in the right relationship to the land, meaning legitimately resident there, for the group to be said to occupy it, and this later place-related right is necessary for a claim to territorial control of a particular geographical domain. Now we come to this second premise, which is more important, I think, for my, my lecture. Group G is a group of the right kind to be the ultimate source of territorial rights. Well, she says not every type of group can be the holder of territorial rights, of course. And her conclusion is that only collective agency whose members are bound by a specific relationship can be the holder of territorial rights. And she, by this term relationship, she means that more than mere interaction, as relationship generates specific rights and with them associated duties and determination to maintain effective forms of government. Now, let me just see. I apologize. This is something. Yeah. So. Now, she says for a collective agency to be called the people, so they can be the holder of territorial rights, the following 3 conditions have to be satisfied. First one is political aspirations, political history, political capacity. really briefly, political aspirations, sort of self-explanatory. They must share a conception of themselves as a group. So they subjectively identify with co-members in terms of either being engaged or desiring to be engaged in a common political project, and they're mobilized in actions oriented towards that goal. Now, political history, she says the people, have to have a history of political cooperation, meaning that we can identify objective and historically rooted bonds of solidarity that are forged by their relationships directed at, political goals or within sort of political practice. She says this is important because it indicates that there is a morally important relationship in place and not just the presence of subjective aspirations. Now, finally, political capacity. She says people must have the capacity to establish and maintain political institutions through which they can exercise self-determination. Now, she understands this capacity in two ways. She says in the first way, we could think of it in a sort of a blocking sense. What does she mean by that? Well, she means that a group lacks capacity that cannot be corrected except by unjust measures. And she says, well, a group that lacks capacity in this blocking sense is illegitimately occupying a piece of land. So if a group is illegitimately occupying a piece of land, then they don't have the claim to territorial rights. So basically, we see that territorial concentration, legitimate territorial concentration, is a necessary precondition in her theory for the exercise of sort of territorial forms of collective self-determination. Now, the second way to think about capacity, according to Moore, is in a much broader sense. She defines it like this: as a predicted and/or demonstrated ability to exercise self-determination and maintain effective forms of governance. What she says now, she says, well, if a group does not meet the capacity in this second sense, it fails to meet the requirement, and this failure then gives rise to duties of assistance on the part of third parties. And she says that, we have these third-party duties to ensure that the group is provided with the means of excessive effective governance, but these duties have to be discharged without perpetrating injustice. So basically, here she finds a sort of out of this duty for assistance, she develops a sort of a just cause for a form of assistance, if that assistance could be given according to sort of some criteria that would then say it's given in a just manner, right? So what can we conclude based on this argument? Well, first, as I said, she argues against armed intervention on the basis of the moral right to collective self-determination. She says if people value their own collective autonomy, their own institutions that enable them to enjoy collective self-government, then we should expect external intervention to sort of be, less likely to be successful than organic change by members of the political community. She calls back upon, the moral value of self-determination, does not inhere only in the fact that through it people create objective justice, but also that the process of making the rules that govern a people's collective existence is itself morally valuable. And the failure to respect political self-determination rights, she says, is indeed the source of justice, but not of the magnitude that would justify coercive intervention to secure them. Now, Walzer, for example, in his classical argument in The Just and Unjust Wars, would disagree with her, right? He basically, after talking about the principle of non-intervention, he provides 3 exceptions to this principle. And these exceptions, at least 2 of them, seem to be in support of the, basing an intervention on the protection of the right to collective self-determination. So these exceptions are, in case of secession, he says when a particular set of boundaries clearly contains 2 or more political communities, one of which is already engaged in a large-scale military struggle for independence, meaning that what is at issue is secession or national liberation. Then he says intervention is justified. Second would be counter-intervention. He says when the boundaries have already been crossed by the armies of a foreign power, even if the crossing has been called for by one of the parties in a civil war, that is when what is at issue is counter-intervention. So the counter-intervention is permissible only to cancel the effects of previous intervention that has violated the principle of non-intervention, and counter-intervention is not aimed at a victory in war. It's just a sort of a balancing even sort of effect. The third exception, according to Walzer, would be humanitarian intervention, and Moore sort of agrees here with him. You know, when the violation of human rights is of such scale that, you know, includes like enslavement, massacre, genocide, or so forth, then basically self-determination, then an intervention is justified. So with these Walzer's examples, we sort of come to a paradox, or maybe a mini conclusion, to say that on the one hand, intervention can be ruled out by a requirement for respect of self-determination, but it could also be justified on the same grounds, you know, particularly in these cases that he says of supporting secessionist movements. Now, McMahon, in one of his, you know, essays, sort of when he criticizes Walzer on a couple of points, he says that you know, sort of he tries to even broaden this Walzer's argument, and he says that Walzer does not include a specific type of conflict in his definitions of secession and civil war, a conflict in which two or more distinct political communities are engaged in a struggle for control of the entire state. So what he says, okay, these are not instances of secession or national liberation, since neither community seeks independence. Rather, each seeks effective control of the other. Nor are there civil wars, as understood by Walzer, because you know, if it is appropriate to describe the groups involved in a civil war as distinct political communities, then that suggests that they're not unified in one of the ways that are sufficient for the possession of a single right to self-determination. Now, the intervention on either side cannot be ruled out on the grounds of the right to collective self-determination. And he concludes that though it is, you know, maybe unclear what respect for self-determination in this case requires, he says it no longer unambiguously requires non-intervention. So let me try to sort of clarify this. He says in the secessionist movements, you know, we have an asymmetry between the claims of the secessionists and the anti-secessionists. He says that, you know, one that makes intervention on behalf of the secessionists seem to sort of, at least at prima facie level, be compatible with respect for self-determination of both parties. Why? Because the goal of the secessionists seems compatible with self-determination for both groups, as they only seek independence or control over one part of the territory, while that of the anti-secessionists does not, because they seek the control of the entire territory. Well, he says in the case of the conflict that he then describes as civil war, that is slightly different from Walzer's definition, he says, by contrast, there is no such asymmetry between the goals of the contending parties. Each seeks to impose its rule on the other. So intervention on behalf of one is necessarily incompatible with respect for the self-determination of the other, or others if there are more than two groups involved. So we come to a really sort of puzzling question. To what extent is intervention, and particularly military intervention, of course, because it requires, you know, higher sort of threshold for justification, ruled out by requirement of self-determination, and in what context it can be justified on the same basis? Now let me go back to see what would Moore answer to this question. Well, it seems to me that she kind of avoids this problem by sort of ruling out an armed intervention on, you know, that could be justified on the basis of the protection of or promotion of territorial rights. However, she does not explicitly argue against any form of assistance. So if you recall, she argues for a duty to assist on the basis of two conditions. One would be that, you know, the group satisfies all those three conditions: aspiration, history, legitimately occupying the land, but fails to meet the capacity in the second sense, meaning that it is inefficient in establishing institutional sort of support to realize their right to self-determination. And the second condition would be that their right to self-determination could only be achieved by just means. Now, the problems I see here, and maybe you can correct me or comment upon this, is that she does not clearly define the difference between assistance and intervention. She basically talks about assistance on the one hand and armed intervention on the other. But what about military assistance that does not entail the use of force? Like sending military tanks to one of the parties in a conflict is a form of military assistance, but it does not entail the use of force, at least not according to my understanding. So I think that it's unclear from her argument whether what form of assistance is justified. Yeah? So we, of course, could agree that assistance is different from intervention in that it does not directly violate the territorial integrity of a state, but I believe it still, has significant influence on the policies inside a country. Now, obviously, the threshold for justifying armed intervention is, higher than the one justifying assistance. But to me, it seems that there is a difference, in sort of a criteria for justifying assistance and intervention, or at least we should come up with a criteria to say, okay, this form of assistance is justified, whether this one is not. The second problem I see with this sort of came to me when I was reading McMahon's paper. So what if there are two communities that are in conflict over the same territory that both satisfy the condition to receive third-party assistance, given that there are no violation of human rights, which rules out armed intervention and sort of a just cause. So how do we decide to whom we should assist, basically? Now coming to human rights, humanitarian intervention is, of course, a story of its own, and it's very complex. It would take a lot of time to go into this, but I'll just try to see what Moore would say to this. She says that the use of force by a third party, as I said, is in case of egregious violation of human rights justified. She does not specifically, in this book that I looked at, provide sort of argumentation, but I think that from her definition of collective autonomy, that implies the existence of a collective people to whom the sovereign authority or the government is ultimately accountable for, we can sort of deduce why she justifies humanitarian intervention. She says the moral right to collective self-determination is based on the moral right to individual autonomy. So, and the state is an institutional mechanism through which these rights are exercised. Now, the state is the legitimate holder of territorial rights only if it's the vehicle for self-determination of its people. If a state threatens the right to individual autonomy, it automatically fails to satisfy the condition of legitimacy, and the room for intervention on the basis of protection of human rights opens up. Now, a whole different story, or a whole different question is under what conditions or on what scale such an intervention would be justified. Finally, Moore argues that protection of territorial rights could be a conditional just cause, like as an additional good. Now, what's the example she provides? Well, she says she uses the example in 1990-91 Gulf War, and I'm going to quote her here. She says, "The coalition led by the United States and authorized by the United Nations agreed to a ceasefire after resorting to Kuwaiti sovereignty, but it stopped short of deposing the Iraqi leader, so no regime change, and of creating an environment in which the Kurdish people in the north of the country, who almost certainly represent a people under my definition, could enjoy robust and internationally recognized rights of collective self-determination. This was almost certainly a mistake," she says. "Promoting Kurdish autonomy would have been a good which helped to justify the war in its proportionality dimension. It would have had the effect of deterring other states who perhaps harbor distinct political communities within their own borders from committing acts of aggression against them, and it was, at the point that the ceasefire was agreed to, quite achievable without significant further loss of life." So here, basically, she argues that this protection and promotion of the right to collective self-determination could be an additional good if we previously have a just reason. To me, this creates one problem and one call for further sort of more complex analysis. The problem, if taken to the sort of if we take the furthest implications of this principle, we definitely end up with some form of politics of interventionism, in my view. The second problem I see with this, basically, let me try to clarify this. the idea of intervention is that it's for limited cause. You know, it's of a limited amount of time. Now, if we allow for having additional goods, once we're already there, who says where we stop? You know, why might not, well, you know, we install a democratic government, or, you know, do whatever we want, or a dictatorship of a form, you know? And the second problem, this idea of, you know, having an additional cause for war could be observed from the point of the ethics of war ending. This is something that I've done in my master's thesis. I'm not going to go deep into this, but I'm just going to say that if we're going to have this argument sort of analyzed in a more sophisticated way, we would have to see whether this additional good could be a justification for the continuation of intervention, or whether it could be an entirely new just cause that would require completely new sort of set of analysis in the leading just war theory or whatever. So, I mean, these are the sort of problems that I encountered with looking at the problems that we usually find when thinking about intervention, particularly, you know, with the implications of Moore's theory and some of her conclusions. My conclusion, or sort of a question, is not very optimistic. I sort of agree that in theory, you know, we probably should leave some room for intervention, particularly in cases of, you know, human rights abuse, of, like, you know, mass violation of human rights abuse. But then, as soon as I was thinking about sort of potential, you know, manipulation and misuse of such practice, I sort of switched back to this idea of non-intervention. So to me, it seems that, you know, it really requires sort of a completely different set of, we have to change our perspective, I think, from just war thinking in order to be able to try, at least, to come up with a specific articulation of principles to justify an intervention that you know, that would be prone to, that would not be prone to misinterpretation, or at least less of it. Yeah. So
thank you.
That's it.